But the next thing we're going to move on to is our fat intake. And there's a number of things that we have to concern ourselves here about our overall fat intake. And the first thing is how much, like what's the total amount of fat that we want to consume in the diet? Because I know people are going to come to this from a low fat background, people are going to come to this from a high fat background, and they're going to have like all these different ideas about where fat intake should be at, right? Now, unfortunately, the research is actually not that clear in terms of where fat intake should actually be at in terms of the overall total percentage of the diet or the overall grams per kilogram, right? We generally like grams per kilogram rather than percentages because it's a little bit more accurate because it actually ties it back to generally the thing that we're trying to influence. And it's also more individualized where like we have some clients that are up at like 5,000 calories per day, and we might not want them to consume 30% of their diet from fats, right? So grams per kilo is generally a better metric in our eyes, at least, right? But coming back to fats, it's kind of a little bit convoluted in the research, and we're left a lot of the time using anecdote and kind of proxy measures, which we'll talk about in a second, right? Would generally be come out of the figure of 0.6 to 1 gram per kilo. That's generally where we want fat intake to be. Now, there's definitely an argument for times with lower, and there's definitely an argument for times for higher. However, most people are probably going to do quite well in somewhere in that range of 0.6 to 1 gram per kilo, right? What are your thoughts on that there initially, Gary?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that going much below that limits both food choices and potentially fat soluble nutrients and other nutrients that come in fatty foods. So I think that's one of the risks of going too low. And then going just too high, it can upset your digestive system a little bit. Sometimes if you're having like up to 2 grams per kilo of fat per day, it slows down gut transit time. If you're trying to get in a lot of calories, sometimes you can feel a bit not so good. I've been in that place myself. And the higher you go with fat as well, you do run into the situation where you're potentially driving your saturated fat intake up too high, and you can run into some problems there too. So for most people, I think somewhere between 0.6 and 1 gram. I will go up to maybe 1 to 1.5 grams for some of my clients who really need to push calories up. But very rarely am I going much beyond 1.5 grams per day, unless it's 1.5 grams per kilo, unless it's a situation where someone just has a strong preference for a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, which is totally appropriate in some instances.
Yeah, 100%. And the next thing that we need to consider with this is that what is the actual bare minimum, right? Because I know some people are going to be like, oh, I don't want to consume fat because, I've talked to my doctor and, they said a little bit of heart disease here going on, or I have elevated LDL or triglycerides are a bit higher or whatever. Or maybe that's something they're concerned about in their overall family and they're a little bit scared of fat, right? So what's the bare minimum? Well, the bare minimum is actually lower than you think, right? Because even though we're talking about, oh, well, like how much would we consume in a general diet? Like we don't actually need to consume that much. However, we do need to consume the essential fatty acids, right? Now, there's a little bit, which we won't get into here, a little bit of discussion about what are the actual essential fatty acids, whether it's these, particular, we'll call them parent molecules or the breakdown products of those molecules in the body. We don't need to concern ourselves with that discussion. However, we do need to understand that there are some essential fatty acids within the diet. There are an omega-6 branch and an omega-3 branch of these, right? Now, the omega-6 branch, we don't really need to concern ourselves with, knowing the exact minimum figure of this, because unless you're doing something completely, weird with the diet, there's, very little potential for you to not be getting enough omega-6 in your diet, right? So we can kind of ignore that, even though they are still essential, and we can kind of ignore it, especially in the modern diet. Now there's, again, unless you're doing something really squirrely with the diet, we don't need to consider it, right? However, with the omega-3 branch, most people are not, unless they actually actively look at this stuff, they're not actively getting enough omega-3s in their diet. However, we can prioritize these and we can get a sufficient amount to both cover the essential fatty acid needs and then also cover, the potential, or gain, I should say, the potential health promoting and benefits of these nutrients as well, right? So when we're talking about the essential fatty acids, if we're like, what's the bare minimum fat we need to consume? Well, we probably need to consume maybe 10 grams of fat, right? And I'm going to say that's from a mixed source that gets you some omega-6s, the general fat sources that we're eating. You're going to get enough omega-6s from those. And then also, we probably want to get like 3 to 5 grams of EPA/DHA per day. We could just break that down into the omega-3s. Now, that would be on the top end. Not the top end, I shouldn't say. It's not like, more is going to be necessarily harmful. But if we're like, what's the absolute bare minimum? Well, it's probably 1 gram per day of EPA/DHA, right? So we can just put that in omega-3s. Most people are going to be most familiar with this stuff in terms of like a fish oil capsule. Most fish oil capsules have like 300 milligrams of EPA/DHA. And so you're talking about like 3 fish oil capsules, right? Unless you're getting a higher quality one or a higher quantity, higher dose one, right? So that's the bare minimum here that we need to be consuming, roughly that kind of 1 gram of omega-3s, and then roughly, a couple of grams of omega-6s, again, depending on exactly what population we're talking about, right? But again, as I said, most people don't need to consider the omega-6 things, but most people do need to consider the omega-3s. If we're looking at, getting the best from our nutrition for our health, for our body composition, for our performance, I'm going to say try to consume 3 grams of omega-3s per day. Now, you can do this through a number of things. You can either supplement yourself. You can buy a fish oil supplement or a krill oil supplement, or you can potentially just eat fatty fish, cold water fatty fish, ideally a couple of times per week. The good thing about fats in general is that we don't necessarily need to consider them always on a single day perspective, because they can be more easily stored in the body. We can consider it on a weekly and even a monthly basis, right? So if you were to say, right, how do I get enough fats in my diet, or omega-3 fats in my diet? Eat some cold water fatty fish 2 to 4 times per week, depending on the size of it. Or if you're not willing to do that, or you don't have access to that kind of stuff, you're going to have to consume some sort of omega-3 supplement, whether it's krill oil, if you're a plant-based individual, or it's omega-3s from fish oil. That's something that you're going to consider, right? Do you have anything to say there, Gary, on the essential fatty acids at all?
No, I think that's pretty clear.
Fantastic. And then the final thing that we want to consider about our overall fat intake is our saturated fat intake, right? So we've got a number, we've got 0.6 to 1 gram per kilo. That's our starting point. We're like, okay, that's how much fat I'm consuming in the day, right? And in that, I'm trying to consume some omega-3s. I know I don't really have to think about our omega-6 intake, because you're going to get it in the diet regardless. But the final thing, the final piece of the puzzle is our saturated fat intake, right? How much saturated fat should we be taking in? This is, something that people will be on such dichotomous ends. People are like, you should consume absolutely 0 saturated fat. Other individuals be like, yeah, the vast majority of my fat intake is saturated fat. If we're looking at this from a health and longevity perspective, especially considering that heart disease is arguably the biggest killer of humans in the world. I mean, like, humans have to die some way, but this is the thing that gets most of us. As we've talked about in a previous episode and previous episodes, and this is one of the biggest killers for humans, especially as we get into our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, or older age at least. How much fat, or how much saturated fat should we be consuming, Gary? What's the number?
I think if you're getting below 10% of your total daily calories from saturated fat, you're doing excellent. At the minimum, I would say less than 15%. Okay. So if you're making changes at the start, see if you can get it below 15%. And then if you can get it below 10%, fantastic, even better. Potentially option to go even lower if you're already got established cardiovascular disease and you're trying to do as much as you possibly can. But most people, if you can get less than 10%, you're doing fantastic. Less than 15% is pretty good. And you can begin to, modify how strictly you control that as well, depending on your blood lipids, for example. If you're consistently consuming 15% of your calories per day from saturated fat and your LDL is like 1.5, it's in a great place, and all your other blood lipids are in a good place as per your doctor, then you can be pretty happy. If you're consuming already 5% calories from saturated fat and your lipids are all over the place and you've got high cardiovascular disease risk, then there might be things beyond the diet that you need to start controlling. So it just depends where you're at with that and your overall cardiovascular risk. But I think less than 10% ideally. Less than 15% would be a good start for a lot of people.
Yeah, and this is important to understand that we're relating this back to calories here. So it's 10 to 15% of total calories. And this again does lead to a situation where, especially for people that are exercising regularly and they have, relatively higher caloric needs, you can be in a position where you're actually still consuming quite a lot of saturated fat, right? And that might be okay for you. That might still be a negative for you just because of the total magnitude of the calories that are being consumed. However, we do have a situation where if you are engaging in exercise, that is kind of a heart protective activity. So you potentially are having less of an issue. Like basically, you're protecting yourself against the higher saturated fat intake that the calorie expenditure is allowing you, if that makes sense, right? But either way, there still is this kind of 10 to 15% of total calories. That seems to be where the research suggests is, we want to keep saturated fat below that. Now, I'm not an advocate of being really scared of the diet. People do this where they're like, oh, Jesus, I can never have butter ever again. Or, I used to like having, a fry up on the weekend and I'm fucked now. Like, I can't do that because saturated fat intake, it's too high. I'm not an advocate of that being like that extreme with things, unless obviously your doctor or your dietitian has advised that because your blood lipids are in a really bad place. For most people, that's just going to be a non-issue. Once you are consuming a relatively healthful diet overall, you're keeping your body weight in check, you're keeping your overall calories in check, and then you're also keeping saturated fat in a relatively good place. Like I've seen individuals that have had like 20% of their diet from saturated fat and they literally are sub 2 LDL, so again, it's going to be back or brought back to your individual risk. However, unless you have blood lipids to work on, unless you have like actual data to work on, it's pretty safe to assume that getting below 10% of your overall calories from saturated fat is probably a good place to be at. And this is, supported by a lot of converging lines of evidence and also the actual evolution of humans. I know a lot of people go like, oh, well, humans evolved to eat a lot of fat and whatever. None of that was saturated fat. I don't know where you're getting saturated fat. You go out and hunt in the fucking Kalahari Desert, you're not getting any saturated fat there, mate. But anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent there. Do you have anything else to say on fat intake, Gary, before we move back to carbohydrates?
No, we can move back to the carbs.